This story is called Witch's Stew by bobwoofix from the Short Stories subreddit. Escape. The moss was cold and damp against her face. Its musky odor, along with the smell of damp soil, filled her nostrils. The thud of her heartbeat filled her ears, drowning out the rustling of the trees as the storm outside the forest beat imperviously against the lofty canopy. She panted with fear and exhaustion, wondering how long she had lain there. She tried to tune her ears to the sound of the old woman chasing her, but all she heard was the tiny chirrups of insects and the occasional bird call echoing through the woods. She knew she couldn't stay here, but the slight warmth of the hard ground eased her tired body and beckoned her just to rest. How long have I been running, she wondered. How long has it been since my escape? Where did my terror take me, deep into the woods or back towards the village? The darkness that the storm clouds brought to the ancient forest meant she could not tell what time of day it was. Yet none of her fears could be answered until she got back up. She was terrified, though, that if she rose up from the slight undergrowth which was hiding her, the old woman might see her. She feared that the old witch might be standing silently just a short distance away, waiting patiently for a slight movement or other sign of where her escapee had gone. She fought against her screaming fears and aching bones and lifted her head slightly to peer over the top of the ferns surrounding her, looking for any sign of the vile witch. Trying not to breathe, she scanned her surroundings, straining to see, but it was an almost hopeless task. She knew that the witch's clothing had been woven from the forest itself, as such blended perfectly with the colors and textures. Even the witch's matted gray hair was filled with twigs and old dead leaves. She could not be completely disguised amongst the trees and bushes of ancient forest that harbored her and hid her secrets from the surrounding villages. Seeing nothing, she finally decided to trust that her young legs could take her beyond the grasp of the old witch and out of the forest. She slowly lifted her head from the warm soil and nervously looked around for any sign of her tormentor. Seeing nothing, she tried to see if anything from her surroundings was familiar to her, whether there was any indication of a direction that would lead her to safety, away from the clutches of the vile creature that had held her captive. She found herself far away from any path or familiar sights. As far as her eyes could see, there was no indication that the trees were thinning, nor could she see the familiar bushes and small trees that populated the forest's edge. She realized that her mad dash for freedom must have taken her further into the heart of the forest than perhaps anyone had ever been before. There was no sign that anyone had ever been this far into the inner territory of the forest, whose huge area stretched across hundreds of miles. Having grown up on the edge of the forest, her father had taught her how to navigate its paths and, when lost, how to find her way home. She was able to quickly orient herself to the south, away from where her footsteps told her she had fled and towards where her village lay. She began cautiously seeking any signs of a man-made path. She constantly scanned around her and especially behind her for any signs of the old witch. By the time the cold night had seeped into the woods and the light of day had completely gone, she was sure she must have escaped the witch's grasp. Yet, she knew not what nasty creatures the witch might have at her command in tracking and capturing her prey, so she remained cautious and dared not pause, only occasionally stopping to sip droplets of water that had formed in the larger leaves as she passed by them. By the time exhaustion had once again taken over her, she was sure she could afford one small nap amongst the welcoming undergrowth. She collapsed to the ground, and as soon as her head hit the soft, mossy soil, she was fast asleep. Nightmare. The repugnant witch's putrid breath washed over the young girl as she whispered in her ear, "Time to wake up, dearie, and eat your breakfast." The small girl was still drowsy and disoriented. She had no idea how she'd got there, or even where here was. Lifting herself from where she lay, as though a swirling haze, she saw a wall made of large, smooth gray stones, piled upon one another, and above its roof fashioned from small branches woven together, holding up by thick hay thatching. Across from her was an old lady dressed in an odd, forest-colored woolen dress, with a woven moss shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her gray hair flowed down her shoulders from a knotted bun at the top of her head. It was matted with twigs and leaves and looked as if it had never been brushed. The smile she wore seemed painted on, contrary to her dark, piercing eyes, which shone with malice and cunning. One of the witch's hands was beckoning her over, and the other was pointing at the table laid out with every delight a child could wish for. The young girl knew she could resist the feast, but she was so hungry and the food was so enticing. As soon as she had taken the first bite, she knew it would be a trap. The witch's cackling laughter echoed around the small stone house as the young girl toppled to the floor. As if in a dream, the girl could see herself enslaved and being used by the witch. She could see herself carrying a heavy jar of water from the stream to fill the cauldron hung in the cottage's fireplace over an already roaring fire. Next minute, she was chopping vegetables and preparing herbs for the witch's brew. All the time she worked, the witch whispered in her ear of the horrors she would endure before she added to the stew as the main ingredient. Her mind fought to escape her dream-laden prison, but every attempt just took her further into the nightmare, every escape scenario leading to more appalling horrors. One moment she had escaped outside the house and was noticing with amazement that it was shaped like one of the old woman's work boots, and the next minute she was on her knees at the end of the path leading away from the house, plucking the herbs that she knew would be used to flavor her bones and flesh. In this dream state, she was picking brightly colored mushrooms from the broth and then also shoving them in her mouth, hungrily devouring them as if they would save her life. Nothing made sense, yet she knew with certainty that if she didn't wake from this dream soon, she would die. The game. 3, 2, 1. Coming, ready or not. Little girl quickly turned from the tree and looked around the small grove of trees to see if she could get sight of her fleeing brother. He was 2 years younger than her, so usually their hide-and-seek games were very short. He would normally hide where he knew he could be easily found because he feared the stories of the witch who was said to live in the ancient forest next to their small village. She speedily ran around each of the trees in the small grove, which was right at the edge of the forest and shouting distance of the village. But he wasn't behind any of them. She was surprised. She decided, since he had just had his birthday and was boasting about being a man now, that he would have ventured further into the forest to hide. So she took the old deer hunter's path and went further into the forest to look for him. Feeling a little scared to be this far, she called out, "You better have got too far in. You know what Father says about getting lost." Then smiling to herself, she added, "You know what the witch would like a nice young boy for her stew." Hearing and seeing nothing of her brother, she started getting frustrated. This game had gone on far too long now, and it seemed as if he was leading her into the forest away from the village, or worse, maybe he'd been abducted by the witch. Suddenly she started worrying about her father's reaction to her brother's gone missing. She'd be in serious trouble for letting him go into the forest in the first place, no matter whose fault it was. Fearing that he had run ahead and maybe caught his foot on a root and hurt himself, she broke into a run to try to catch up with him. All the time she was yelling his name louder and louder as the panic rose. Suddenly she spied movement off the side of the track. Thinking it might be him, she headed for where she could see all the branches moving. When she got to the now still branches, she saw more movement ahead, so she sped up thinking that he might have been trying to get away from her still, lost in the fun of the game. By the time she realized that she wasn't chasing her brother, she was hopelessly lost, having changed directions many times in her mad pursuit. Night had fallen and she was all alone. Her mind was full of fear and panic, which made it impossible for her to reason, simply reorient herself to get home. Along with the cold of the night, all her running had caught up with her, and she started feeling overwhelmingly tired and hungry. She tried looking around for a place to get warm and something to quell her hunger and thirst. Luckily, there was a large tree nearby with a hollow center. She crawled inside it and found herself in the dry wooden cave, sheltered from the wind outside. Growing on the inside of the trunk, to one side were some mushrooms. They looked like any other mushrooms. She took some and began eating them. Safe. "Judy, wake up." She woke drowsily to her father incessantly shaking her shoulder and yelling at her. For a moment, nothing seemed real, as if she was still caught inside of her nightmare. Then she realized that her father, to be there, she must have now been near her home, safe from the witch. She jumped up and gave him a huge hug. "You gave us a real fright, girl," exclaimed her father. "We've been looking for you since yesterday when Tommy came home without you." "Yesterday? How could that be? The witch had me for days." "I think it may be time for your mother and I to give you a lesson on what to eat and what not to eat in the forest, young lady. The only witch that got you was the one in the hollow tree." And with that, her father opened his hand to reveal the mushroom she had eaten when she sought shelter. It's called Witch's Stew. That story is called Witch's Stew by bobwoofix on the Short Stories subreddit. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.